Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first training for art literacy this year, 2023 to 2024 at Lake Grove Elementary. I'm Teresa Aguilera. I am a co-coordinator of art literacy this year at Lake Grove, and I'm very excited to introduce our first artist for October, Sandro Botticelli. So it's pronounced Boticelli. He's an Italian Renaissance painter. He actually was known by his nickname. Sandro Botticelli is not his real name. His real name was Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Pepi. Botticelli means barrel in Italian, and his older brother was actually called this because of his large size, and the name sort of stuck. So it's kind of a funny thing if you want to talk to your kids about going by a nickname, being known forever by your nickname. That's what happened. Their whole family adopted it, and that's who we know today. This is a portrait of Botticelli that was not made by him. It's made by another artist in a book about artist lives named Giorgio Vasari. Botticelli lived in the 1400s. He's an Italian Renaissance painter. We'll talk a lot about him in the context of other Italian Renaissance painters. And I'm going to present a third to fifth grade version of this. We may end up with a K to second grade version of the presentation that has a little bit more, a little fewer, more like interactive questions for the kids. You're welcome to use either one in your classes. So Botticelli was born in Italy and lived during Italian Renaissance, as I mentioned. Here is Italy during the Renaissance. This was a period of cultural rebirth, and artists played a really big role in that. So in a question for your third to fifth graders might be, can you name any other Renaissance artists? Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci are a few that we probably have learned about in previous Artlit sessions who are working around the same time as Botticelli. He is different, though, in a few key ways from other artists during his time, and we're going to spend a little time today explaining how his unique talents and view and approach contributed to new ideas in art. The one way that Botticelli was different is he spent most of his entire life in just one city, which is Florence, Italy, represented here again by a different artist, by that same artist, Giorgio Vasari, who did the woodcut in the first slide. But Botticelli was born in a tiny, modest neighborhood called Ognissanti and is buried in a small church there. So if you happen to be there, the church still exists, the street still exists, you can go see where he grew up. Other artists tended to travel across Italy doing commissions and special projects, but the furthest that Botticelli ever went to paint was at the Sistine Chapel. 25 years before Michelangelo painted his first frescoes there, Botticelli was invited to paint. Michelangelo's work overshadowed that, but you are welcome to go see that. His work, a lot of his work is still there in frescoes. So he wasn't very famous outside of Florence until his work was rediscovered and had a renewed interest in the 19th century. Now, something to know about Florence is that it was a very wealthy city at the time, lots and lots of money in the city, lots of political power in Italy. But Botticelli's family was not wealthy nor powerful. His father was a tanner or a leather worker who later worked as a goldsmith. And his work as a goldsmith actually brought the whole family into contact with a lot of artists because gold was very, very common as an embellishment at the time. Botticelli used gold in some paintings that we'll see later, usually on commission, where the person who bought the painting would be paying for that. And he may have been training goldsmithing himself, which plays a role in the use of some of his techniques. So here's a self-portrait of Botticelli. If you're doing for younger kids, you might even say, here's a painting Botticelli did, and ask something like, what do you call a painting you do of yourself? Who's done a painting of yourself? Those prompts will be in your slideshow. This is actually a small part, also called a detail, of a much larger painting called The Adoration of the Magi, which we'll look at later. This portrait shows Botticelli gazing directly at the viewer, and his face is turned at 3/4 view, which was really customary in portraits at the time. Artists at the time believed that this angle kind of allowed artists to reveal more of the subject's personality. And so he was known also for doing this, but something that's different about Botticelli is just the really penetrating stare he would give his subjects. And it's often referred to as a very humanistic approach. He tried to make them really natural seeming. And we'll create one of these kinds of looks in our hands-on project. Something to know about Botticelli is that he is known as the master of line. And even though his other portraits are similar in some ways, his use of line is one way his portraits are very different from other artists at the time. So you can note in this version, this picture here, the exacting contours of the face, the neck and facial features, and the eyes and lips being really outlined. They're very defined on the edges. And the details of the flowing curls and the hair are equally delineated with fine lines, the folds of the robe. You'll see these things come up again in future pictures. And some people think that Botticelli's expertise with line might have come from working as a goldsmith, in which you rely heavily on line and shape because there's no real color or contrast you can do with metalworking like that. So this is a thing to focus on as an element of art as part of this lesson. A line is one of the seven elements of art, and it's considered by many to be the most basic element of art, the very fundamental thing that makes art possible. And a simple way to think of a line is to imagine a point that moves. It's basically a moving dot. So we'll see lines again here. This painting is called Judith with the head of Holofernes. Can you name some ways Botticelli uses line? Is a question you might ask of any grade. And just see if the students are able to pick up things like line here to define features of the human form, for instance, those facial features like the eyes and the lips, to convey three-dimensionality. So in the fabrics of their dresses, the lines are used in a way to suggest that there's a shape underneath that dress. And also to draw the viewer's attention to the subject. So the way that the trees are sort of bending towards the women and the lines of their arms are framing their bodies. And then finally to imply movement. So kind of going with that thing about the fabric, the fluttering and swirling fabrics are made with these rapid contour lines, which identify the folds of the clothing and pressing against those shapes. And it makes it look like they're moving forward. And that's something that was very unique at the time of when most people were painting very static images. Botticelli also used contrast in his work, and this is another one of the key points that we want to make in this lesson. Contrast in art is using unlike visual elements in juxtaposition or kind of in opposite or comparison to each other to create meaning and intensify the characteristics of the work. So it's taking two different things, putting them side by side, and that kind of forces one to notice the differences. So contrast has often been called the golden rule for creating art because it's one of the best tools to engage a viewer. If line is just drawing attention, contrast is really making viewers view meaning in a single piece of work without having to have multiple pieces side by side. And artists utilize various elements to create contrast. They can do it through shadows or light or color, as you're seeing here, or size, as you're seeing here, and also composition. And also ideas is another one to note. So you can actually have two opposing things representative of each other, something light, something dark. I think the light side, the dark side of the Force. If you're a Star Wars fan, similar kind of idea. So putting those two things side by side, that's a contrast of ideas. And Botticelli plays with all of these types of contrast in his paintings. So we'll call those out as we go through the next few images. This is a painting called Fortitude. And this is actually Botticelli's earliest documented work. It's pretty stunning for somebody so early in their career. Who knows what happened to his earlier paintings, if there were any, but this was painted when he was about 25 years old. And can you name some ways Botticelli uses contrast in this painting? Is something you might ask your students. So some of the answers here might be color. The bright red fabric against the neutral whites and blacks really draws the viewer in. Shape. You'll notice that the geometric wooden elements up above and below the person in the frame are really setting off the more organic, natural shapes of the person, who is very flowy, very fluid and organic looking in the human form. The shadows, the deep shadows imply depth and push the subject to the forefront, and then light. The colors are luminous, almost like they're glowing in comparison to some of the elements behind that are deep in shadow there. This is a portrait called Man Holding a Medallion of Cosimo de' Medici. And you will hear Medici come up a few times if you've studied Italian paintings, Renaissance painters before. They were often the patrons of the artists, paying for their family in great political power and paid for a lot of art and other creative endeavors to happen in Florence. So in addition to allegorical and biblical subjects, Botticelli became a sought-after portraitist, and that is what we'll do our hands-on project about. So it's worth lingering on this one a little bit. Early portraits were primarily of high-ranking, well-known personalities from France. We actually don't know who this person is, but he's holding that medallion, which was, I think, meant to imply protection from the family, for the family, like of the family. And due to his success with these early paintings that we just looked at, the one like Fortitude, for instance, Botticelli came to the attention of the Medici family, and they shared a common interest in a human philosophy known as Neoplatonism, which basically just explored Greek and Roman thought in sculpture and painting. And some of the key things they did was playing the Christianity-based imagery against pagan imagery like Roman and Greek mythology. And you'll see some of that in future paintings. Maybe not something to bring up with the younger children who aren't going to be as aware of that kind of thing, but it could be a conversation with the older students. So this half portrait's unusual for its time because it contains a landscape in the background. Botticelli usually uses a plain background, and it's one of the first portraits that we know of to show someone's hands. The medallion shape in his hands actually also is not painted. That is actually a cast stucco piece that's been inserted onto the wood. So something you might ask some of the older grades is what techniques you see here that we've already talked about. And those things are hopefully contours or outlines. So use of line, you can see it in his hair, in his eyes, and the lips there. No one really has lips that are that outlined with that kind of lip liner exactly in real life, but it's here and it's really making a contrast of the in his face. There's contrast of light and shade to create a sense of depth. And the subject of the three-quarter pose with the eyes directed at the viewer is something we saw in that very first self-portrait. A question you might ask the K-2 grades is what geometric shapes you see in this painting. And of course, there's a circle in that medallion. You can also kind of ask them to see other less obvious geometric shapes that are implied in the composition. Shape is something that comes up in this presentation a lot, but we didn't pull it out as a specific key thing to focus on. We wanted to focus on the the line and the contrast. But if you kind of blur your eyes, you can see there's a triangle made by this shape because of the contrast of the light and the dark in the foreground and the background. Okay, so this one is a pretty different painting. Many artists portrayed their patrons in all their riches and finery in famous biblical themes, like particularly this one of the three kings, the Magi. The thinking at the time was that by placing the family in a religious scene, they kind of had their wealth sanctioned, it brought them closer to God and raised their status in the community. So these paintings were very, very popular. Certainly Botticelli was not the only one making these. This became very popular in the Renaissance and continued to be popular with wealthy patrons for a long time. And Botticelli himself painted this exact scene, the Adoration of the Magi with the three kings, 5 times. This is the first or the most famous, sorry, of them. And the patron who commissioned this wasn't even a Medici, although a lot of the Medicis are pictured in this image. The work was commissioned by Gaspare da Lama. And Botticelli wanted to show that person's connection to the powerful family. So that he is here in the white. There's Botticelli, and there's da Lama and the white hair, and here's the rest of the Medicis. So something you can ask before you hit that forward, you can see there's animations on here. Something you can ask the kids is, can you spot Botticelli? Because this is actually the painting where we saw his self-portrait. He's the figure on the far right there that we saw at the beginning. Here's some more portraiture. This is one of a Medici, Giuliano del Medici. He was assassinated in a failed attempt to take power. And portraits across the city when that happened were actually, there's a lot of details there we're not going to get into in this presentation, but the portraits were commissioned as memorials and warnings to other plotters. And this one was likely commissioned by him before his death to commemorate his sadness over the death of his own beloved, Simonetta Vespucci, who actually is a woman that Botticelli modeled a lot of his women off of, but it inspired the rest. And so it's kind of an iconic one of the time. A fun question here, trick question, similar to the where's Botticelli in the last one, is there's a dove in this painting, and can anyone spot it? Hopefully the screens in the classrooms are high enough resolution you can actually see these. I know the light makes it hard sometimes, but the lower left corner there's a brown dove. And this painting's full of symbolism, so it's a good place to introduce that idea here. because Botticelli loved to include this in his work. So doves mate for life, and it is actually perched on a dead olive branch. So that's very symbolic of the situation that this Medici found himself in. Um, the open window was a symbol of death at the time, and the eyes cast downward is pretty unusual. We talked about them usually looking directly at the viewer, so this is very unusual and probably symbolic also of death or sadness. And again, you can point out lines, contrast, facial features, and fabrics have these really defined lines, lots of contouring on the face, which you'll want to notice and use later in the hands-on project, and the contrast of the pale face and the dark hair. Here's another version of the Adoration of the Magi, painted at the height of Botticelli's career, possibly while he worked in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So a question here that's interesting to ask is where all the compositional lines lead to in this painting. So if your eye is drawn in by lines, what are those lines and where are they leading? They're really leading to that center focal point with the baby Jesus. And this painting expresses another way that Botticelli differed from his contemporaries. He did not care about actual perspective, about realistic perspective, which was a big thing at the time in the Renaissance was mathematics and perspective. That's not something he was after. Instead, he used architecture to invite the viewer to enter the painting and highlight the focal point and draw the attention. He used it to manipulate the viewer's gaze. And the use of line here is obvious, and you look at it in the ruined temple, obviously, but there's also organic lines created here by the people, the way their bodies are bending to the middle, and also by the way that they are looking towards the center. So kind of implied line. Botticelli also composed his paintings to match the shape he was painting. That earlier Fortitude was painted on an oddly shaped wooden panel. This is a round one. It's known as tondos, or which is Italian for round, and they were popular in the 15th century to decorate people's homes. So they'd be painted on wood like this, and then they'd be framed with these gold frames up in the corner. You can see that. They often depicted the Madonna and Child, so that biblical imagery, and they usually used gold as a decorating detail, not only in the frame, but in the painting itself. So here you can see gold in the rays of the sun, in the crown, in her cape and her hair. This has a lot of gold in it, more than most, and someone very wealthy probably commissioned it in order to pay for all of that to be included. So a question for especially the older children, but probably the younger ones would get this too, is how does the round shape of the painting affect the placement of the figures in it? If you were painting this, and they were standing straight up like they might be usually, they'd really be cut off. So the way that he's adjusted it here is all the people are leaning inward, framing Mary and Child, and the arms are curved to match that circular shape, kind of this repeating motif of these circles kind of framing around. And it's just a very pleasant composition, even though it could feel very forced because it's such an unusual shape to paint in. Okay, now we're getting into some of the big ones. This one is one of Botticelli's most widely known works, La Primavera, the allegory of spring. And it's a good time to talk about allegory if you're up for it. An allegory is a story or a poem or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. You can kind of see this again, this theme of like some hidden things in here. Botticelli painted several mythological paintings like this one, which are based on Greek and Roman mythology. And they're very representational. This one's got the harmony of nature and mankind, and it tells a story from right to left. And I know right to left might seem unusual, but he's using that line and visual movement to draw you from the right to the left is the thinking. So the visual movement to go through it on this one starts on the right with the bent lines of those trees. Then you go into that kind of blue guy, the green, which is the south wind zephyr pursuing the nymph named Chloris, the nymph of springtime. And then when she's captured, and then you see there, I think with Child potentially, but covered in flowers, certainly, that is her changing into Flora, the goddess of flowers, which is a symbol of Florence as well. And then your eye is drawn to Venus in the middle, the goddess of love, who's the central theme of the painting. And note that her tilted head kind of looks a little like that Madonna in the last ones. You see that overlapping of reuse of some of those same themes in visual language. And directly above her is a blindfolded Cupid shooting an arrow towards chastity, which draws your eyes back down towards the three graces, which are chastity, beauty, and passion, dancing in their feet, barely touching the ground. And then on the left there is Mercury, the leader of the three graces and the god of the winds, lifting his magic staff in the wintry clouds away as he makes way for spring. So definitely not something you're going to pick up if you're not aware of Greek mythology, but if you were, at the time it was a very popular pastime to know about those things. you might understand this as a story. So some questions, there's a lot of questions on this one because this is what they often call the scanning image, which is the primary image you want to focus on in the lesson. Very representative. So a question that's fun for all is how big you think this painting is. These images are actually life-size. The figures are life-size. So this is a really enormous painting, all made in tempera paint on wood. And tempera is fun because that's something that even kids use today. Another question is maybe more fantastical. Does this look like a place you could visit? There's really no wrong answer here. The background is, you know, an orange orchard, which I think is representative of Florence again. There's a lot of flowers. It could be someplace you might visit, I suppose. And then do these look like real people? This is kind of the crux of it. So there's no wrong answer to this exactly, because certainly they look very realistic, but just as Botticelli manipulated perspective in buildings and things like that in the last image we saw, he often modified human forms also in order to create graceful lines or beautiful shapes. So he would manipulate the human form into things that were completely unrealistic. Arms and proportions are longer than realistic and exaggerated. Look how long Venus's arm is. Poses are impossible to achieve or to sustain. The three graces, it's impossible for anyone to hold themselves into those positions. And this is sometimes referred to as idealized beauty. This is where that idea comes from, that maybe there are things that we're trying to attain and cannot get to. That's not what Botticelli had in mind. He certainly wasn't saying everyone should look like this. He was more interested in just realizing the beauty and figuring out how to have it be represented and how to make his paintings the most beautiful they possibly could be. So there will be a series of other questions in the slide notes for this one. If you want to pick a few out ahead of time and ask them, you can. Don't feel like you have to. I know this has already been about 20 minutes of presentation. It's about all the kids will be able to take. So feel free to cut any of this out that you want. That said, we'll breeze through a few more. So this is Pallas and the Centaur. This is another allegory that was hung together with La Primavera. So it's, again, very huge life-size figures. It shows the Pallas Athene, the goddess of wisdom, next to a centaur, that mythological creature with the body and legs of a horse and the torso, arms, and head of a man. And this is meant to represent, again, she's the goddess of wisdom, representing not love of knowledge, and the centaur is meant to represent earthly pleasure. And so it's a study in contrast. That idea of contrasting ideas is very much present here. So she represents reason, he represents animal instinct, she stands out against the sky, and he's kind of muted against that wall, and the static lines of the wall and the halberd are really in juxtaposition with the flowing lines of her body. There's a detail of some of the line work in the hair. This is the other big one. So The Birth of Venus is considered Botticelli's other masterpiece, along with La Primavera. Again, he was less concerned with the correct anatomical depictions of the figures, and he really focused on their graceful movements and fluid lines to tell the story of the composition. Famously, of course, her arm is incredibly too long. What is going on with the neck? Really not exactly a human body you would find. But on first glance, you know, it's just a very beautiful piece, and he's trying to represent an idealized beauty. So this tells another story. You can get into it if you wish, but basically Venus has emerged from the sea on a shell that's driven to the shore by the flying wind gods, Zephyrus and Aura. They're showering down roses. Roses here represent their spring flowers attributed to Venus. This may be why they're attributed with love. And there's a nymph bringing her a robe. So it's kind of a little story that you would know if you were into this mythology at the time. And he's also depicting two opposing forces, the movement of the winds and the nymphs kind of coming together and stabilizing this creature, this figure in the middle. So some questions you can ask here are what lines and shapes are dynamic and which ones are static. So her hair, the fabrics are dynamic and flowing. The oceans and the line are kind of implying movement. The lines of the shell are dynamic and energetic, and the trees and horizon are static and provide contrast. And here's a detail of that. This is a good one to linger on because we'll be wanting to use some of these techniques. You see on her face, she's got lots of outline around the chin. The face is outlined, the eyes are outlined. You've got line use in the hair, of course. And using the hair, especially, we're using line to show movement here, which is something fun to introduce into the portrait project. Yeah, so she's so ideal in her beauty, we don't really notice her long, long neck until we take a closer look. And here's one more portrait to prepare for the hands-on project. This is in some of the slides for that. This is portrait of a young man. In this case, he omitted the background and just focused on the person, which is what we'll have the kids do. It's in sharp contrast to the background, and it really kind of shows his personality, kind of a, not a very excited face, but you feel like you might understand that there's a real person here. He's not wooden, he's very organic. And it's a good example of ideals for facial proportions. I won't read them out because I think it's more fun and easy to do rather than see. Great. So now we're ready for the hands-on project. I'm just going to get some things into shape here. And I will start the video. Is that working? Oops, let me. Actually, not sure how to do that. Let me stop sharing. Okay, here we are to do the hands-on project for Sandro Boticelli's Ideal Proportions of the Face. What you'll need for this, which we explain in the slideshow, which hopefully you can watch that and me do the demo at the same time. But all these slides are side by side, are step by step inside the deck right after the lesson. So you should just go straight into this. And the same demo, the same lesson is happening for same hands-on art project will happen for all grades. So what you need for this project are this tracing background, a blank sheet of paper for each kid, a pencil, and then that's all that you need to start with. But then you'll need colored pencils, which we have these ones in the colors of the world, and also crayons, and then some regular colored pencils because you'll want to be able to add other colors besides the skin tones. So you have all that assembled. The first thing we have the kids do is write their name and their teacher on the back. Hopefully in something they can read, good handwriting. That's very important so we can make sure we get this piece back to them at the end of the year and get them credit if we need to in the show. Okay, so once they have that, put the blank piece of paper on top of the tracing template. It's not going to fit exactly because we got nice drawing paper and this is going to be a little bit loose. I do hope that the video is being weird. I do hope the presentation shows up really well on the screen because it's a little bit hard to see, so you can kind of see. But the first thing we're going to do is outline, just trace that image down below like this. And then you'll see that's the head. Then there's a center line, and there's a center line this way, and then half, and then half. And we'll have to have the kids share these. I think we might not have one for everyone, but they only need it for that amount of time. And if for some reason you don't have these, you can just do a fold in half and then a fold in half to the half, and you'll have the same thing. Basically, try to get the head to be really big though, not very small. So then this can be passed along to someone else. So we'll talk about the top line, the middle line, and the bottom line as a reference. If you want, you could always number them. Okay, the first step is to draw the eyes, and we're drawing idealized proportions per Botticelli. You might have done a different lesson. If you go online and you find a video where they're telling you how to draw very realistic ones, these are a little bit different proportions that are considered ideal by Botticelli. So here we draw the eyes. The thing to note is that we could draw a line, but the center of the eye is going to be halfway between these two spots, and all these notes are on the deck, so you can put that there. We want to put the bottom of the line directly, the bottom of the eye directly on the line. So something like this. The trick here is don't make it big round circle, but try to do something a little more like oval shaped or what have you. This looks a little bit weird. You can always erase, fix it if you want. Would really like to get some kind of shape in here to show that eyelid happening. And then you can draw in the circle here. If it's easier to start with a pupil, you can do that too. But notice that that pupil is kind of on the bottom line, and then you don't have to draw the whole thing. It can be cut off by the kind of heavy eyelids here, whatever you want. You can close in the bottom if you want, but you certainly don't have to. A lot of the tips in this deck are about not closing in shapes all the way. Then you draw the eyebrows. The eyebrows need to go halfway between this second line and the top line. So you can kind of like put a little guide here if you want. Eyebrows, whatever shape you want. Something like that. Cool. Next, we draw the mouth. I personally found this to be the trickiest part. The trick here is one tip is to draw your line down from the center of the pupil, and that's supposed to be where your mouth corners end up. I will say that makes for a really big mouth, so maybe you want to imply that. The top of the lip comes to the top of this, maybe a little bit over this line, so you can do some really like big bow shaped lips. I didn't really realize why they call it a bow shaped mouth until I realized it's like a Cupid's bow after looking at Boticelli. And then maybe you can do a little bit of like a smiley face, but turning the lips up a little bit hard. Encourage the kids to just kind of try things out. You can always erase if you don't like what you have. You just want to try to make it a little realistic, not as cartoony, but you know, it's fun. They can do whatever they want. It ends up being perfectly fine. Then we draw the nose. The nose in the example is very straight on. You can also do something like the tip in the deck here where it says to draw, you know, like more of that 3/4 nose. The lining where it lines up is halfway between. So if you do halfway between the eyes and the mouth, it will be this right about here in the middle. And that's where the tip of the nose should end up with something like this. You can just kind of use some simple, again, lines, being a moving dot. Just use some lines to like make a nose. Okay, then the ears, which will be covered with hair probably, but good to draw them in anyway. So that's the top of the ears are the same height as the eyebrows, and the bottom would be where the same level as the nose. So it's another good reason to draw this line kind of all the way out. So it'd be like something like this. Not super important. Again, you get like the perfect ear. I don't recall any ears in Botticelli's paintings. They're always covered in hair. Oops, can you see that? Yeah. Cool. That's the entire pencil part. Note, I used kind of light hand to draw these. And when you look at it kind of from afar, you can decide if you want to change some things around, fix it up a little bit, you know, however you think makes sense. But after this, what happened next is the pencils. So I recommend getting the colored pencils, these ones out. There's also, of course, just these ones if you want to do blues and yellows. I would start with an outline of the parts. So it can seem scary to commit to using a dark color, but you just go for it, you know, just kind of like commit to some of these lines here. Maybe it makes people feel good to like start with something that you know can be black. So you can do something like this. Make that circle. And then, yeah, I'm gonna do some brown eyes, maybe. Encourage them to take the time to color it all in really well. There's not a lot of white blank canvas space in Renaissance paintings, so good idea to have them spend some time putting them all, just filling it all in. And of course, you've got eyebrows. If they're uncomfortable doing the outline to start with, you can always start with some lighter pencil shading and then go back in. I imagine that's something that Botticelli himself did. I doubt he started with the lines necessarily. Who knows? Again, let's like commit to some of these. You can always use a pink for the mouth, or pull out a red if you want to have a red mouth. Be fun. Cool. Okay, you don't need to do too much necessarily, because then you can just go into here and start, pick a color of tone for your person. And just start using realistic colors to fill in everything. This is where the crayons can come in handy, because you might not want to use up, like take a long time to color in a pencil with pencil. You can grab, color from here. Start coloring in. You don't have to color the whole thing. You can kind of wait, because you might want to do the hair. Actually, it's a good, I hadn't thought about that, almost forgot. So just get to this point. Then this is the next step. We'll jump to this, is add the hair. So the hair is a fun part, because you can remind the students this doesn't have to be them. It can be a self-portrait, or it can be an invented person, or it can be someone they know. So what's fun though is to imagine the hair flowing. So use those lines. You use lines here to define the face. Now you can use lines in a different way to do something with the curls and all that. So we can come in here and like, think in the example, they have kind of long flowy hair, but you can always come in here and try to make shorter hair. These curls, or just straight hair. Botticelli had a lot of curly hairs in his, but you don't have to do that. You could do whatever you think makes sense. So once you have some lines in there, you can kind of color in a little more. Get a little carried away, why not? Cool. Once you have that, you can go in and you can add more shading. So really the rest is just kind of creative fun time, final touches. There are some tips here. You can color in the face of the features. So we did the lines, but a way to make it more three-dimensional is to use contouring. So that might be something like, pressing really hard to make a shadow. Maybe there's, if we're doing coloring in the face, like using the crayon to kind of create darker spots where we know we have shadows. It's perfectly fine to just color the whole thing in and then go back in later and add that extra. But we do want the full face. So this might be one of the pieces that goes on display in the library. So we'd love to pick some of the best pieces. Sometimes we do that all fifth grade. I'm not totally sure if it'll be a mix. It'd be nice to have a mix, but it'd be nice to have really vibrant, not a lot of big color in here. So having it be lots of contrast, if you want to use one of the terms from the lesson. How can we get some contrast in here? You can come through and add some more lines underneath. Definitely want to add the outline to the shape of the face. And this is where you can kind of budget, start to give it whatever face you want. You don't have to use the outline you have. Something like that. More hair. And then a tip, if they wanted to look a little more of a feminine look, you can add the eyelashes and things like that. You can see the one in the example took on more of a woman's look, a Botticelli woman. Trying to do man here, but yeah, whatever you think works. So that's kind of it. Just play with it. Start doing some more shading, however you think makes sense, in whatever tones make sense to you. And yeah, that's the lesson. Don't forget to, if you have time, if the kids have time, you can do some fun things like outline. The one on the example, you can kind of come in and draw an outline around the hair. That makes it stand out even more. And then you can always also go in and add some, some color behind or something. Like you can, a little bit of contrast color if you wanted to add that in. But it's not necessary. It's just whatever they have time for in the class. Yeah. And throughout, if they wanted to have erased the lines, I forgot to mention, you can erase the lines. But the truth is, once they have it all kind of colored in, it really, they're not that noticeable, and it kind of speaks to the lesson anyway. So it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, cool. And that is Boticelli. Ideal face portrait. Sign it in the corner, and you're done. And then at the end, just have the students stack them all up. We don't necessarily have to have the drying racks because, they're all, these don't take time to dry, but we do want to collect them all up. So please collect them all and have them put back in the arts closet, and we will go through them to figure out who's going to get presented, and we keep them all year, and then who's going to get put up in the gallery, and then we keep them all year and give them all back at once at the end. So please do not give them to the students. Do give them back to the art coordinator's room. Great. Thank you so much.